Well, Brand Farron, Danny Hillis, Alan Kay, the Disney Fellows. Where is everybody? That's what I thought. Bran, Alan, Danny. Can everybody do like a tight of 5 minutes, something about what you do? Something? Hi, Ricky. He was at the first CAD too, in 1984.
We just wanted Edward de Bono to know that we believe in the one-hat theory of creativity.
Aren't you going to sing a Mouseketeer song or something?
Why?
Sing the song.
Why? Because we like you.
Do we donate our hats?
That's right. So, hello, everybody. Anyway, I had it like this before, and someone made a comment. Anyway. Excuse me.
This is all Kevin Kelly's fault.
I'm a little bit of a human petri dish today.
Very creative.
We're going to talk to you a little bit about storytelling and kind of a few different points of view on it. And excuse me if I'm a little out of breath. I'm kind of dying at the moment, but that may be part of the show. I think it's interesting, if you come from the kind of background that I do, that you think story is just about everything, and you assume that everybody else knows that. And then occasionally you get a kind of rude awakening because you find out other people don't think that. And as you get out into, quote unquote, the real world, and you're earning a living, and for most people, their needs are pretty simple, ignoring the spiritual for a moment. It's about competing for their time and money. When you're a kid, money seems like the big thing, and it's what you compete for. And about 10 minutes before you drop dead, time takes on a whole new meaning. And a lot of what we do is try to take those away from other people. We try to come up with ways of doing things that are stimulating, exciting, fun, engaging, serious, any number of things. And we use storytelling as the approach. It's been interesting for me because when I started working with a lot of people in the technology side of things rather than the art creative side of things, I realized that there was often a different approach. And they looked at the world based upon requirements. They would follow people around, determine what their needs are, and provide a solution for that. And I came from a world where you live for the big idea. You live for some so compelling thing. You pay no attention to focus groups. You ignore them because the focus group only tells you what people think they want based upon their experience. What you want is something that goes beyond that and changes everybody's view of things. And that's often what storytelling is about. It's crafting, it's developing this big idea, and then as you develop your story, keeping yourself on track to that. And I think it's very interesting because if you look at what's going on now in the world, look at the explosion of the World Wide Web, look at a whole bunch of things, and you look at it from the perspective of maybe it has nothing to do with memory, maybe it has nothing to do with computing networks, about free software, none of those things, but it has to do with, for the first moment in history, computing technology is getting good enough to be useful as a storytelling medium. And that maybe we're not entering the information age, but we're really entering the storytelling age. Because I think storytelling is actually much more interesting than information, especially information as an abstraction. And if you start looking at that, you realize that interoperability, the ability to get the things to work with each other easily, is how we became us, how we became, rather than herds of humans, became a civilization and had art and rich ideas and things which make life worth living. It's because we developed language, we standardized that language, we got everyone to speak some set of those languages, and that sense of interoperability let our civilization take off. And there were a whole bunch of other things, but that really got it started. And it's why the World Wide Web is taking off, interoperability. By a simple set of rules, we ended up with something which allowed a whole bunch of computers that IS people would tell you could never talk to each other. If you had an IS department running the World Wide Web, we would still be trying to get the first two machines to actually acknowledge that each other exist. And nothing personal. And what's interesting to me is if you do believe you're going into the storytelling age and you look at computers as storytelling systems, it gives you a whole different perspective. You realize that storytellers have developed an extraordinary set of technologies to solve the technical limitations of the media in which they choose to work. A scientist looking at the notion of compression can try to transmit a picture, and you might do run length compression, where you take everything that happens to look the same in the image and just say, well, for the next little bit of space, it's all going to be white, so just send white, rather than little bits of numbers for every possible space on an image. And people talk about semantic compression, the notion of, well, gee, once you understand how people work or you understand what motion is, you can develop ways of compressing that get it even tighter. Storytellers realize that, for instance, if they want to create for you the most horrifying demon in the world, what you don't need is bits, what you need is imagination. Human imagination as the ultimate form of compression, such that the boogeyman, the creature that is so horrific that it ties into all of our primal fears, it's a different one in each of your minds. But a master storyteller gets you to form your own in your brain and does it with a very few number of bits. This idea of imagination as a form of compression is why not transmitting the picture at all, but basically doing it in the dark. Boogeyman is much scarier when you don't see it. Any picture I could transmit to you with any amount of mathematical compression is never as scary as the one that you will build in your own mind, especially if guided by a master storyteller. Understanding that human beings are sensor fusers. We live in an extraordinary world. You know, we're in here in a multi-terabyte room, yet we don't seem overwhelmed by having to deal with this database. I mean, this is a complicated space that we're in. But we have context, we have our emotions, we have feelings, we have our experience and our history. And what storytelling lets us do is tap into that to be able to change people's lives with a comparatively narrow amount of bandwidth. And I think it's an extraordinary time to be alive. I think that at this point, we are just seeing with computers, which are still primitive, pathetic, ugly, horrible, nasty little lumps, with all due respect to any of the representatives from any of that. But computers as we see them now are still awful devices. But they're getting good enough so that you can start telling a story. Now, is a web page a story? Sometimes a web page is a story. Is it going to be about interactive video and other things? I don't think any of that really matters. What I think matters is the computer is now a thing that, first of all, kids are growing up with from day one. Two, that there is a richness of experience which people are tapping into. And I want to stop talking, but I've witnessed an extraordinary thing. My mother, who I've bought a new computer for every year for the past 10 years and has never used it other than to be polite when I'm there, just discovered the World Wide Web. And she's an artist, a painter, a landscape, abstract expressionist, and it's changed her life. It's brought her into a whole new community because all of a sudden now it's communicating in a visual form and along a set of ideas that she finds compelling. And that's the test. If your mother is hooked, you know you're going to be somewhere. I guess the only final thing that I look forward to is how do we take the art of storytelling and the art of communicating, the art of finding the big idea, and learn to establish something which doesn't exist yet well in the computer world and is almost non-existent on the web, and it's called trust. I don't think we understand trust in the information age or in what will ultimately be remembered as the storytelling age. And I think this notion about learning to understand that, and how do you build a series of relationships with people, how do you stop looking at the computer as a display system and a CPU and a network, and how do you start looking at it as one system where human beings at both ends are part of that, that's going to be the secret to our success. We're just on the cusp of being able to do that. I look forward to seeing how we can bring the technologists and the storytellers together. And if we grapple together with this notion of trust so that you feel like the kind of experience that you could have with these new information networks are ones you can believe in, I think it's going to be an amazing ride. Thanks.
Pretty good for somebody who's almost dead. Well, I've been struggling with the idea of stories for many years. I'll try and tell you why. One of the things I think we've all realized from time to time is that we probably, in spite of the fact that we think that we're looking out on reality, it's probably occurred to us all from time to time that we actually don't have a direct apprehension of reality, whether being born to perceive reality directly or in learning to perceive reality through our culture. And there are lots of different evidence for this, but I think one of the simplest ones is just to point out that humans are always arguing with each other to the point of killing each other. And if we all directly perceived reality, that would never happen. We would not have anything to argue about. Instead, I think what's going on is we live in a kind of waking dream, or even a hallucination that exists inside of here that we call reality, and for efficiency reasons we pretend it's reality because you don't really want to go through a whole philosophical argument about what's real and what isn't and what's perception and so forth when a saber-toothed tiger is charging you. Right? That's part of the reason it was set up the way it is. But in fact, one of the reasons stories evolved was a way of trying to explain what's around us. But I think as stories became part of art, I think part of what art is, maybe the larger part of art, is an attempt by artists to get us to wake up a little. A lot of what I think of as serious art is an attempt to get us to see that there's something else out there than what we might be perceiving in a day-to-day period. And I think Coleridge, who besides being a poet was a theatrical critic, had a very good expression for it, for what the dilemma is. He said, bad theater is what people go to when they're hoping to forget, and good theater is what people go to when they're tingling to remember. And perhaps today he might call bad theater what we call entertainment, or what comes across to us as entertainment on television, because a lot of it is a kind of a legal soporific that people use for that exact purpose, whereas what we call high art usually requires some concentration, some work on the part of us, and a lot of the time we're just too tired to do it. So I think that the dilemma of the story is this, that because stories and most artistic forms create a world of their own, to the point that, for instance, the great movie you just saw today that contradicts the great movie you saw last week doesn't bother any of us at all, because these stories create their own world. And within that world, we're in the now. We're not in the past or in the future, but we're in the now. That's part of the charm of it. And we're carried along by the logic of that particular story. And I think of stories as being, in this sense, as being a lot like mathematics. In that mathematics is not about the real world, but it's about what you can spin out of a few simple premises and some rules of inference. So mathematics can be about Euclidean geometry, it can be about non-Euclidean geometry. These contradict each other, but within themselves they're completely consistent. So I think of mathematics as kind of a special kind of story that people have made up so they can tell stories that are quite consistent within themselves. But I think we all know that the Greeks got into trouble with science because they thought God was a mathematician, and therefore all they had to do was to sit in their hammocks and deduce along the same lines as God did how the world was put together. And it just doesn't work that way. So the thing that I've been fighting with is how to introduce science to children who want to have a narrative structure for their lives and a narrative structure for most of the things that they do. But science does have a narrative structure. But the special thing about science is that it doesn't allow the internal stories that are made up in language and mathematics to dominate the need to actually test things out. And so I think it's this, and this is something we almost never do about a story that we like. is to see whether that story actually obtains. And I think the simplest way of thinking about the dilemma of stories here is by thinking of some of the most simple stories that all cultures have, which are proverbs. Even our scientific culture has lots of proverbs. And the way proverbs works is the following. If you come home from a trip and your significant other is really glad to see you, then the proverb for that is what? Absence made the heart grow fonder. But you come home from a trip and your significant other is not that happy to see you. And what's the proverb? Out of sight, out of mind. If something looks like it might confirm what you think might be true, you say where there's smoke, there's fire. But if you see something that might tend to disconfirm something you think is true, you say you can't tell a book by its cover. Now, proverbs are more central in non-literate societies because if you list out all of the proverbs, you immediately see that for every proverb there's an anti-proverb. But the reason they work is the same reason the stories work, is that each proverb, taken in isolation, explains something to our satisfaction. So I guess what I would want in the future of stories, as the net takes us out to a new kind of narrative, is a way of dealing with this idea that things can be incredibly interesting, as exciting and romantic as anything spun out in old narrative forms or in mathematics, but it's just as exciting to actually probe out into the tough world around us that doesn't respond to any of the ways we'd like it to be, and to find out what it is. So that's my take on stories. I think if we're going to live in a narrative world, we have to upgrade the notion of narrative to include science, or I think we're all lost. Danny?
I guess I've been thinking a lot about what kind of stories need to be told right now. Those of you who heard me on Monday know that I think that this is a very strange time in human history where we're going through a kind of transition. And I think one of the things that can help get us through it is the right stories. And I don't know what it is, but I know that it's always important in a society to have stories that kind of match your problems. So, for instance, in an agricultural society, basically all agricultural society have stories about cycles, about resurrection, because there the big problem is getting through the winter. You have to be told over and over again that after the winter is going to be a spring. It's all going to be okay. So the story in some sense sets up the rhythm of the life and sort of explains to you the context in which you're operating. I think if I think about what's the basic mode or motif of stories for 20th century America, it's probably stories of conquest. It's sort of manifest destiny stories. So sort of a story that kind of resonates with American children is Jack and the Beanstalk, which, if you think about it, is basically a story where the hero finds this wonderful new land, kills all the native inhabitants, and comes back with the gold. And I think that in a sense, that basic story of sort of conquering new land is, obviously, it's a big part of American history. It's why these metaphors about the frontier, the electronic frontier, have such resonance for us. It's why the space program succeeded in sort of capturing our collective imagination, because it was a great story. It fit with a certain model of conquest and exploration. I don't want to say that the conquest is a negative part. But I have a sense that that particular story is not exactly the relevant one for the situation that we're in now. And there was an interesting moment in time when we were sort of running out of the classical frontier in the West. And so the last Indian tribes were under duress signing over their land to the federal government. And this guy, Chief Seattle, made this famous speech. I'm sure you've all heard Chief Seattle's speech, but it's the one where he talks about, so you want to buy our land. I mean, do you want to buy the sky too? Do you want to buy the air? How can you imagine us selling the land? And the reason that that's a famous speech is because he describes very eloquently the kind of context and the kind of story that American Indians, or at least the mythology of them, were living in at the time, where he talks about how this total sort of connection with the land. He uses phrase like, the wind is our breath, and the sap flowing through the trees is our blood, and the buffaloes are our brothers, and so on. And it's clear that it's a scheme. It says this is our relationship to the place. And the most interesting part of the speech to me, though, is where he says, we don't want to sell you the land because you don't have this same story. You don't have this same relationship. And he says this phrase of, your destiny is a mystery to us. I cannot imagine what your story is going to be. And he says that your relationship to this land is obviously conquering it. And I don't remember the words he uses, but basically you want to conquer it. And that's fine. I see that that's going to work. You're going to do it. You're very powerful. You're going to build roads from one end of the land to the other. You're going to string your electric wires all over the place. You're going to chop down the forest. But then you're going to run out of your story. What are you going to do then? It doesn't make any sense to me. I just don't understand it. Now, I think what's happened is, in a sense, Chief Seattle's prediction is almost beginning to come true. I think we've stretched that story about as far as we can. And I think somehow we need, stories are like nutrition for a culture. We're missing some vital ingredients right now to get us through this transition. And I think we need some new kinds of stories, some new kinds of metaphors or myths that sort of give for us a picture of, in some sense, why we should solve all of these problems right now, why we should really care about the world that we're leaving hundreds of years from now. Because unless we have some kind of picture about that, then everybody's just going to kind of throw up their hands and give up and do what's sort of immediately easiest and most selfish. And so I think that that's a big problem that I'm wrestling with, and I don't see exactly what it is, but the millennium clock has been mentioned a few times, and what that is for me, I don't really have time right now to explain a lot about it, but what that is for me is a story. It's a story very much like that story of the oak trees that I told on Monday, a story that we're planting some acorns now because we do believe in the future, and we do believe we're going to get through this time, and we do believe that there are going to be people here in the year 3000. There are going to be people here in the year 4000, and we feel some connection to those people, and we feel that, in some sense, we believe that we have the capacity to become something more than ourselves. And somehow, this group of people is going to have to figure out a way of making this society believe that. And I think within this people are, the people with the communication skills and the talents to communicate that story, if somehow we could understand what it was. So I think that's the challenge for us.
The Apple Fellows.
Disney.
Oh, sorry. I get confused here sometimes.
Disney.
See you.